it's a little intimidating going after what we experienced last night. Last night, the chair of Africana Studies, Professor Abul Petrie at San Francisco State, spoke about Black liberation pedagogies. And you'll see, for those of you who were here last night, you'll see definitely a disciplinary difference between Africana Studies and I am a U.S. historian. We like notes. We like lectures. We like to make sure people take lots of handwritten notes in class. And Dr. Petrie's style and content was just amazing. And so last night, Dr. Petrie spoke to us about unshackling education from a past that was based on Black enslavement and the fostering of docility among Black Americans. And he talked about embracing a future, an educational future, based on liberation and empowerment. What I'm going to talk about tonight in many ways follows, builds on what he was talking about, and I'm going to talk about how higher education was actually structured to not facilitate the success of groups historically underrepresented in higher education. It was not structured to enable the success of women. It wasn't structured to enable the success of people of color, and it wasn't structured to enable the success of the working class. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about how actually that's gotten better, how in fact things have improved. I still feel like, you can hear me fine? You can hear me fine? No, see, not so. Okay. Try to do it a little more. I'm trying to look back and forth and I lose the mic then. And so what I'm going to talk about is how things have changed in the 21st century, thanks in part to the work of some of the Black academics that Dr. Petrie cited last night, and to the work of many, many other activists. And I want to put this in the context of the challenging conversations, thank you. I want to put this, that even sounds better to me. I want to put this in the context of the challenging conversations that we're seeing in the press, in the media, in politics about the value of higher education. Specifically, the question of, is a college degree worth it? I don't open up anything, any magazine, newspaper, social media, Facebook, Instagram, without seeing someone's posted an article or a data point about folks questioning the value of higher education. So we have the negativity of media-generated conversations, and I've been particularly disturbed in the last few years of how negative the media is, and how I think it's a lot of clickbait. The headlines are really negative. Then you read the article, it's not that bad. But I don't know how many people read the article. And then the negativity of politically generated conversations about higher education. And like I think everything these days, it's so divided. The majority of Democrats in the United States think highly of higher education and public education, and the vast majority think it's worth it. And sadly, the majority of Republicans do not think that higher education is worth it. So there's an ideological divide, which I'm going to talk about, and I think it has a lot to do with what Dr. Petrie talked about last night. And so you have these conversations going on, these headlines, these one-liners from politicians, but then it doesn't match all sorts of other things. It doesn't match what employers say. More than 80% of jobs that are posted require a college degree. So we hear, is it worth it? But then 80% of jobs require it. Just require it for an interview. And then it doesn't match what California parents are saying. The Public Policy Institute of California just published a survey, I don't know, a week or two ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. 74% of California parents want their students, their children, to get a 4-year degree. So again, you have these conversations, and then you have the folks who hire people, and then you have the people who are producing future students saying they want it. And much of the negative conversation focuses on cost and indebtedness, right? That it's just so expensive, students are going crazily into debt, and therefore it's not worth it. But even there, that conversation actually doesn't reflect a lot of the actual data about what a college education costs and how much debt folks go into. My theory, and this is one of my pet peeves you'll hear about a couple of times of this evening, is that it's because most of the conversation about higher education is driven by the experiences at elite private institutions. What does Stanford cost? What does Stanford give? It's driven, and I know you both have backgrounds in elite institutions, it's driven a lot by that experience. And in fact, the majority of Americans do not earn their college degrees at those institutions. The majority of Americans earn their college degrees at places like San Francisco State and the California State University. So we're one of 23 across the state. Those institutions don't cost nearly as much, and their degrees generally don't leave students with the high debt we hear about. It happens, but again, not as a rule. And even at many privates, they're not as expensive as they sound, because after financial aid, the cost of attendance is dropped. So I'll just give you just a couple of points to demonstrate that. The total cost of attendance at Cal, I'm going to use mostly Bay Area schools. The total cost of attendance at Cal, tuition, housing, food, books, fees, the whole thing, it's about $34,000 a year. After financial aid, the average cost is $18,000 a year. At San Francisco State, the same total cost of attendance is about $26,000, and after financial aid, it drops to $14,000 a year. And for the lowest income, California has an incredibly generous financial aid structure at both the CSUs and the UCs. For those in the bottom quartile of socioeconomic status, they almost all graduate debt-free. Their grants, their loans, especially if they live at home, they'll definitely graduate debt-free. But even if you look nationally, you keep hearing stories. I keep hearing stories about the folks with $100,000 in student debt, right? That's atypical. It's a tragedy, and we have to look at it, but that's atypical. The national median is about $30,000 at private universities in terms of what students graduate with at debt, $26,000 at publics, and then $35,000 at the for-profits. That's where a lot of the debt is generated. So I want to just contrast, though, that to California for 1 second. Again, we have our challenges, far from perfect, but boy, this is not a bad state to be in for a whole host of reasons. The national average for indebtedness at someone who graduates from a public institution is $26,000. The CSU average is $18,000. At San Francisco State, it's $18,005, and at the UCs, it's a little higher. So that's still debt, but $18,000 for a 4-year investment. All the national data suggests that over a graduate's lifetime, they'll earn $1 million, $1.5 million more. Unemployment is less, underemployment is less. Every indication is that for an $18,000 investment, the outcome is good. So then, if the news is actually largely good, why is the narrative so bad? Why is the narrative so bad? And this is where I want to tie in a little bit to what Dr. Petrie talked about last night. Again, most don't have high debt, but enough do that we should pay attention to it, and we should be laser focused on why those that accrue a lot of student debt do. And again, a lot of it rests at the for-profits, which are increasingly being scrutinized. Also, growing costs at privates that don't have large endowments. The privates with large endowments can afford to subsidize their students in need better, but the private with the lower endowment, students may end up with more debt. My favorite, or not my favorite, but the one I spend the most time on is time to degree. How long do we keep students at university? This should be a short-term commitment for a long-term gain. And we shouldn't be holding them 5, 6, 7 years. So that time to degree is important. And then graduate education. A lot of the debt that folks focus on does get accumulated in graduate school. And while that's not the focus of what I'm going to talk about, it needs to be studied, it needs to be addressed, the data needs to be out there. But I actually think part of the focus on indebtedness and questioning the value of education is, again, politically and ideologically driven. When you undermine the confidence of the public in higher education, you undermine their willingness to subsidize public education and to support financial aid, right? And if you undermine that, it helps the anti-tax folks but it does make university either more expensive because you're going to raise the cost, or you're going to restrict who gets admitted, and you limit access. The other is, again, also politically driven, undermining the confidence in universities by depicting them as hothouses of left-wing nut jobs. Yes, there are some of those at universities. Yes, there are right-wing nut jobs at universities, but the vast majority of universities and their employees are not nut jobs, nor are their students. But again, if you caricature us, you can undermine confidence in these institutions. And then you're very successful, right? If 30 or 50 years ago, 90% of Californians thought that the value of a degree was worth it, and then they see their taxes go up to support education, support the UC system and the CSU, as we did here through the 20th century, you're like, it's okay. But if you've been told it's not worth it, and they're all crazy, you're going to be less likely to support public education. So, and that's ultimately the agenda of the right, which is to undermine public institutions, undermine confidence in public institutions, and we're no different than others. And this is the direct connection to Dr. Petrie. I don't think it's any coincidence that the attacks against universities have risen as, in fact, we become better at doing the work that Dr. Petrie challenged us to do yesterday. We have become much better at being places that challenge the status quo, that take on structural racism, sexism, classism, and a host of other isms. And we've become much better at being places that focus on providing access to to education, and also success or degree attainment for groups that were historically left out of higher education, particularly communities of color. So the better that we became as what I would call kind of counter-hegemonic or institutions, things that took on 100-year-old norms, then we got criticized for actually not being very good. So again, that's someone's driving that criticism with an agenda. Tonight, I want to talk about how we got better. And again, this is that irony. I think we've gotten much better at what we do, and therefore we are criticized much more loudly by the right for what we do in caricatured ways that other people can respond to. A word about my focus. I have spent my entire career at public colleges and universities, not research universities, at teaching-centered, bless you, at teaching-centered institutions. And so almost everything I say is directly reflects the experiences of the California State University and other public systems, although I do think it does reflect what has happened at some privates. But in general, I'm focused on publics. And I want to start with two anecdotes about the bad old days of the 20th century. And for folks my age, we think of that as recent history. For my students, it's the last century. They weren't even alive. It's that last century. So let me talk about the bad old days of the 20th century. And I'll start with an experience my husband, who is here, had his freshman year at UC Davis in 1976. And his experience was replicated at, I would argue, almost every university in the country at some point. It was freshman orientation. The dean or some faculty member who was speaking to the new freshmen very proudly told them to look to the left, look to the right, and one of you won't be here next fall. And that was a point of pride, that the weak were going to be driven out, the fit were going to succeed, and that made UC Davis a good place. No, he was one of the third. So that's why he's a proud UCSB alum today. Go Gauchos. So, but that, I'm not just, I love the UCs, and I also think Davis is a fine institution. That would never happen there now. But that's what happened everywhere. But I'm going to now move forward from that moment to about, I don't know, 16 years later, and it's even later than that, 25 years later, and I'm a faculty member at a public university in the state of New York. And every 10 years, universities have to go through accreditation. We do kind of a self-study. We talk about what we're good at. We talk about our are opportunities for improvement, and then we hope to get a blessing of 10 more years of accreditation. And the university I was at was going to be going through accreditation, and someone realized, oh gosh, somebody has to write the section for the self-study on our retention and graduation rates. Let's ask Lynn, she has trouble saying no. And so they asked me, I said, sure. I had no idea what the hell I was doing. And so I quickly said, well, can I see what we wrote 10 years ago? So this would have been about 2002. What did we write in 1992? And in 1992, that particular university in the liberal arts, only about 65% of their students came back from the second year. Look to the left, look to the right. One of you won't be here. That was our numbers. But even more horrifying, only 25% of our freshmen graduated. I was a young faculty member, and even I knew that's like unethical, right? Like, how did they not shut us down? And so I asked, could I see what we wrote in how do we explain away that? And this was, I have this memorized. It was a very lengthy response. Our retention and graduation rates are no better nor worse than our peers. And those numbers, 67% and 25%, said, see you in 10 years, good job. Those are the appalling days of the 20th century. Dominant visions of universities as places that weeded out the weak, rewarded the fit, and it was all based on individual effort. Universities accepted almost no responsibility. It was about how hard did the individual student work and not the university. This is the same period in history when U.S. News & World Report single-handedly invented the college ratings business, and it is a business. And for anyone who's interested in this, I urge you to listen to a 2-part podcast that Malcolm Gladwell has done recently on the emergence of U.S. News & World Report. And then, of course, dozens of organizations followed, and Gladwell does a really brilliant job of showing that these rankings push universities to admit the wealthy. Admit the wealthy. There are so many advantages of admitting the wealthy. So same period that's going on. And then public institutions like the City University of New York or the Cal State system were doing the good thing, which was focusing on access as the numbers of students who wanted to get into college was growing exponentially. They did the right thing. They said, we're going to be access institutions. We're going to serve our region. We're going to serve our states. But where they failed was they didn't couple it with degree attainment. They just focused it on admissions and not actually graduating the students. So even what I would argue the most thoughtful and ethical institutions were not focused where they should be. And again, why? That focus on individual effort, that it was all about the student. It was up to the student to succeed. The institution had admitted you, they'd hired brilliant faculty, they'd created state-of-the-art curriculum, and now it was up to the individual student. There were other kind of organizational and cultural obstacles as well. Deficit thinking. And I remember when I got to the CSU system in 2008 being shocked at the extent to which this existed. I call it the hegemony of can't. Students can't do this. Some students, right? Usually students of color, usually low-income students. They can't go to college full-time. They can't do math. They can't take a full load. They can't. And so when you tell someone, or you're thinking that, you create structures that enable them to not be able to do it. You end up creating your own problems, and I'll give you one example. So the early focus was on fixing the students. We got hot and bothered by all these standardized tests that were going to show us if students were ready to do things. We hired people to teach to the test to show us that they could do something. At best, we gave them some tutoring, and at worst, we labeled them remedial. I think the greatest scandal in 20th century higher education was remediation. I'll just talk about in California, we did this based on SATs. So you could have a student, you ignored their grades, you ignored what math courses they took, you ignored what writing courses they took, but based on one standardized test that has been proven for 40 years to predict a person's socioeconomic status and the degree attainment of their parents, you then labeled them remedial. I'm talking hundreds and thousands of people went through this. And the studies about and again, it was well-intentioned. I don't want to be throwing my predecessors under the bus. They thought they were doing the right thing, that they would find out where the student was weak. And they were trying to get away from the look to your left, look to your right by saying, well, the person who's going to leave is probably needing remediation. So it was an attempt to solve a problem, but it didn't solve it. It actually made it worse in a couple of ways. First of all, the courses were thoroughly unnecessary. It was a waste of state resources and waste of tuition dollars for what happened in the privates. It actually made students feel less connected to the institution. They got there, before they ever got there, they thought they didn't belong. In the CSU, it went something like this. You got this great letter, congratulations, you've been admitted to a California State University. You're in the top third of high school students across the state. Aren't you great? And then a few weeks later, we sent you another email that said, but based on this one day of testing, we've decided you're not college ready and you have to go through the stigmatized program. And then it didn't have any effect on their future success. So things were bad in the bad old days of the 20th century, which, by the way, the critics who say it's bad now think those were the good old days. They were the good old days for somebody, but not for most people, right? So this all began to change in the early 2000s. First of all, there was a growing focus on access and commitment, and I want to give credit to some of the folks that Dr. Petrie talked about yesterday, and there are a host of other social justice activists who just started to agitate. This is unacceptable. And then there was pressure from business community and the right, and about how can we be funding public higher education and you're only graduating 1 in 4. I agreed with them. So there was criticism on both sides that made us start to focus on attainment. And then there are these national organizations, in particular the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, that are focused on higher ed policy, higher ed issues, and they started doing studies. And in 2005, they did a transformative study where they identified 12 universities across the country, public, that were doing a really good job with the students that the other several hundred institutions were saying they couldn't graduate. I can't graduate a low-income student. I can't graduate a remedial student. I can't, because they can't. And then there were these 12 universities that were doing it. And I had an opportunity to participate in that. And we studied Montclair State University in suburban Newark. Newark, New Jersey, low-income, largely black city with the usual kinds of challenges that face those communities. And Montclair State was kicking butt. The University of Maryland at Baltimore County, which is now the biggest producer of black STEM PhDs in the country, they were doing better than what they were the folks that we could look to say students they could, if institutions did the right thing. So ASCU published a study about that. ASCU and the association that represents land-grant universities, the big universities like University of Illinois and things like that. I think Davis is a land-grant. They said, we have to start sharing our data publicly. We have to shed light on these graduation rates. Because the moment, for example, my institution in New York had to publicly display that they graduated 1 in 4 in 4 years, that number started to change and change fast. And they didn't just look at grad rates. They also published what percentage of your students come from communities of color, and they disaggregated it. What percentage of your students are low income and eligible for Pell grants? So they really kind of took the lid off of this secret thing that was going on at universities. And then finally, I give an enormous amount of credit to President Obama. When he was elected in 2008, he made the completion agenda the hallmark of his administration, holding us at public institutions and privates as well, but largely publics, accountable for the success of every single one of our students. And he did it largely by watering the green spots. Not just publicly shaming us, but putting funding in it, inviting the folks across the country who'd had incredible success with this to the White House to meet him. There was a big competition in the CSU about which CSU presidents got to meet Barack Obama. I sadly wasn't one then, so that didn't happen. And universities increasing, so from that time I started in 2002 when I was told that our 25% graduation rate was no better nor worse than our peers, and that was okay, till 2015, there was a total revolution in higher education. And now there's not a single conference I don't go to, whether it's my disciplinary conference in history, or it's an Ask You conference, or it's anything, American Council on Education, where there isn't an implicit acceptance that universities have an obligation to graduate the students they enroll. I know that sounds so no-duh, but it wasn't no-duh, and it wasn't, and now it is. So we did things. We got rid of remediation. After 30 years of talking about getting rid of remediation, we got rid of remediation. The sky didn't fall, because the sky didn't fall. Students' grades what we replaced it with was students took the class they should be in, which was usually pre-calc or calc, and then they had like a recitation section attached to it where they got a little extra help. And we found out, again, there is only 20 years of data, but you have to prove it for yourself that that works. And we moved, and this again addresses what Dr. Petrie was talking about, to understanding that the pedagogies we'd all been trained in were Western and designed to educate largely white men. A lot of that weeding out culture. When you start a class by telling a class, look to the left, look to the right, one of you's gone, you've almost guaranteed that the person who leaves, with some exceptions, is female and a person of color. You just further weaken their sense of belongingness. And there are other things we do in classes. For people of my age, back in the day, you had one midterm, one final, maybe a paper. Everything was high stakes. That's just not the way most people learn. It's not the way our work lives are even structured. Nobody says, here's a year, and you've got one big project. If you fail, you're out. Right? That's just not, we meet in our teams weekly. We do all sorts of things. So there's been a lot of work on inclusive pedagogies with particular attention to the kinds of things that Dr. Petrie talked about yesterday. We've improved advising. It used to be I met someone whose daughter graduated from San Francisco State, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. And he said she just basically had to guess what to take to graduate. We don't do that anymore. And then there were lots of administrative barriers. We love to put holds on registrations and then make students wait in long lines to get those holds off. He's laughing. You probably were in some of those lines, right? I know I was, because I was bad at doing things on time. But again, if you've got a complicated life, you're working and going to school, waiting in a long line isn't going to happen for you. Or again, if you're feeling a tenuous connection to the institution or higher ed, it's not a barrier. Students with a lot of means or have parents who call a university and harass the university, that student might get over that barrier. The student who doesn't have that barrier becomes an off-ramp. So we've done a lot of that, and we're far from done. We've got a lot more to do, which I'll talk about in one second, but I just want to tell you how dramatic the results have been. This you're never going to see on the front page of the LA Times, the New York Times, or San Francisco Chronicle. They're going to want to tell you how we're failing, but let me tell you how we're succeeding. So if you were a freshman in the CSU in 2000, got admitted in 2000, which would now make you very, very old, you'd be like 44 years old. So if you started in 2000, 48% graduated, less than half. If you started in fall of 15 years later, that number's up to 63%, and we're targeted to hit 70% in the next 2 years. Dramatic increase. If you were a transfer student who started in the fall of 2000, 62% of you graduated. If you were a transfer student who started 17 years later, in the fall of 17, 80% graduated. And our goal there, which we're on target to exceed, is 85. I think we're likely to get to 88 or 90. Those are just numbers, though. I want you to take a moment to think about the humans behind the numbers. These improvements in graduation rates were accompanied by a tremendous growth in enrollment. In 2000, the CSU, there weren't 23 of us in those days, but all the CSU admitted about 63,000 new students. In 2015, we admitted 110,000 new students. So near doubled the number. When you take the growth in enrollment plus the growth in graduation rates, the CSU between 2015 and 2017, in 2 years, produced an additional 20,000 degree holders. What makes that even more impressive, though, let me tell you who those were. They were all students of color. In that same period, black students increased by 31%, the number of black students in the CSU. The number of Asian students in the CSU grew by 132% during those years. And the number of Latinx students during that period grew 270%. So it wasn't just 19,000 more degree holders, it's 19,000 generally low-income students of color for whom earning a degree is transformative, not just for themselves, but for their families and communities. Has anybody read that story in one of the papers lately? No. Way more fun to talk about how some left-wing crazy academic has run some student into $100,000 in debt, and now he's a barista. Now, my husband became a barista after college, and so did I, and that's how I met him. So I'm all for starting your post-college thing as a barista. But it's just, that's not the narrative we hear out there. But in the CSU, and I'm going to conclude here, or start to conclude here, and then we can open up for questions and conversations, we know we still have a lot to do. In particular, we need to eliminate opportunity gaps based on race, ethnicity, and Pell. So all our numbers have gone up for every group. Far more black students graduate from the CSU than they used to, far more Latinx, far more Asian, but the gaps between white, Asian, and then black and Latinx students are still about 10 percentage points. And we need to be truly achieve our mission, we need to eliminate that. And so what I see happening is the student success movement of the early 21st century, can you believe I'm saying things like early 21st century? It's going to become the educational equity movement. It's going to be much more specifically focused. And there are things we need to do. We need to focus on affordability. We do. It is a problem. We need state support for public institutions. Every time you see a tuition increase in a public, it is not to build a climbing wall. It is not to give the president a raise. It's because the state has reduced its support. And in fact, we haven't even kept up. If we actually had raised tuition in the CSU as much as we've lost state support, kind of with cost of inflation, I think tuition would be higher. We need better financial aid for all. We need better financial aid. The Pell Grant hasn't kept up. It's not much higher than when I was a student. We need to push privates to embrace the access mission and completion and open their doors to students outside of the highest socioeconomic runs. The statistic that always I find shocking, I think it's Stanford, but it could be said similarly of the Ivies. Those institutions admit more students from the top 1%, the richest Americans, the 1%, than they do from the bottom 60% combined. Bottom 60% combined. And then this is when I talk about the cost of tuition, or at San Francisco State, it's only $7,500, but our total cost is $2,600, and that's the cost of housing. So the state has supported tuition, but then you're left on your own to pay for housing. And that's always been a problem, but nothing like the last decade. And I don't think I need to explain to anybody in this room why it's bad everywhere, but it's way worse here. So we need the state to support housing. And there's some good news. The state of California has actually, for the last 2 years, given the CSU a decent budget and the UCs. And this year, for the first time, they made a historic investment in student housing. First time ever. And I'm really excited that San Francisco State got $116 million for a new res hall that'll be open in 2 years. So we're able to build it, and then that supports 65% of the cost, so we can drop the cost that we charge students. And then I think this is really exciting. There are other organizations that are giving U.S. News and World Report a run for its money. And Bobby's the one who collects all this data for me, so he's got a big smile on his face. He knows where I'm going. They increasingly rate universities by what I think matters. So we're regularly rated one of the most transformative institutions in the university and in the country, and the CSUs in general. We all rank in the top 25 or 50, I guess 50, for upward mobility. How are you doing at admitting low-income students, getting them degrees, and launching them into meaningful careers? That, to me, is a much better measure than how wealthy your students are. So I think there's some movement out there. And then we have to do our part. We have to focus on equity-driven completion rates. We have to control costs. We have to be mindful of the impact of costs. And that's particularly true at privates, but publics too. And then I don't think we've done enough to tie all the legs of I think of it as a three-legged stool. You have access to higher education, you have completing that degree, and then the meaningful career part. Just in the same way that we used to tell students, well, we let you in, now you're on your own. We have too long said, well, we got you in, we got you out, now you're on your own. We need to not do that as well. So what I hope you take away from this is that, the news out there is pretty crappy every day, but there is some really good stuff happening, and I'm particularly proud to be in California and at the CSU, where I think the best stuff is happening. So with that, I will...
daily by how much negativity is out there. People are talking about the world is swirling the drain.
Yeah,
We're all going to hell in a handbasket. There's no hope. The human race is doomed. Every day.
Yeah.
Every day.
If it makes you feel any better, they've been saying that about us as a U.S. historian for 300 years. I saw a presentation recently about San Francisco. We were apparently doomed in 1906, never coming back from that. And then even going up to the 80s, we were never coming back from that either. So, which isn't to say, climate change is real, but we know that here in San Francisco. We have substantial problems. But no, but there's some good stuff happening too. Yeah, and I'm going to just speak to my students. And I know I got a recent alum somewhere. I don't know where Jupiter. Maybe she stepped out. I've got a room full of young alums here, whether it's from San Francisco State or another institution, and they energize me every day.
I appreciate your overview. That was just wonderful. Also, your initial reiteration of unshackling education as a starting off point. I really appreciate that. I have to say, since you're referring to 2000 as people's idea of ancient history, so I'm UC Berkeley, 68, and I'm still involved in UCs, CSUs, and community colleges in where we're going with education in the state of California specifically. So my question is that in the last several months, I've been thinking about the 1960s California Plan for Higher Education, which said that all graduating seniors will go, almost all graduating seniors, be average, I know in Berkeley. Now it's a 4.22 or something like that. I think 4.8.
Yeah.
And started thinking about that in this year, in the 21st century. And so I've been looking at that, and we obviously, in the 60s, we're only thinking of, from my perception, UCs and CSUs. And I realize now, number one, that community colleges have to be part of that picture, because if we want high school students to have some advanced continuing education, that we have to consider that very rich resource in our state, which has been developed but somewhat under the radar, and not so they can transfer to a CSU or UC only, but there's lots of good reasons for someone to go to a community college for all the good reasons we have, colleges. So I became aware recently that there's been some looking at revising the master plan. And I found that there's a select committee at the Assembly that's looking at revising the master plan. So I wonder if you could just shed any light on the global response to what you're so nicely laying out here. Are you aware of, for California, not global, but for California, are there other points where people are looking at unshackling education in California? As we experienced it, it was fantastic,
Right.
but clearly it needs to be unshackled.
First of all, good for you to be involved in the CSUs and community colleges. And I want to make this clear, and I say this as a native New Yorker, right, who's supposed to always think New York's the best. Nothing compares to the state of California for the quality of public higher education in all three units. So yes, we need to restore the value of a community college degree. Not every job needs a four-year degree. Not every job needs a graduate degree. But if we continue to undervalue those degrees, then people will go for the next. So I think we do have to pull them in there. Okay, this is being Zoomed. I'm going to say it anyway. I might be looking for work at the beginning of next week. I'd be shocked if they revise that master plan. Even if I live a long time, I don't know that would happen in my lifetime. And it does need to be revised. It doesn't reflect the reality of the three systems anymore. It doesn't reflect the reality of the state. And the sad part is what was best about that plan we've still been good at the guarantee of access. The plan always was that the top third would have a space at the CSU and the UCs. We're actually, the last numbers I heard are a couple of years old, we're actually giving access to about the top 42% or something. So we're still doing well there. I'm going to be, where it's failed though, is in the state support for it. So do you want to share what you paid? I'm going to make him share what he paid for Santa Barbara.
$72 a semester. Housing was about $100 a semester for the residence halls.
Remember, what did you pay for Santa Barbara? $250 a quarter about a decade later, right? Yeah. Where'd that go? Where'd that go? And I'm going to tell you, this goes to Dr. Petrie's point. I don't think it's a coincidence that there was declining state support at the same time that the student body became brown and black. I don't think it's a coincidence. And that's why all of this negative stuff about indebtedness and left-wing nut jobs, all it does is undermine confidence in public education and make people more reluctant to pay the kind of taxes they need to pay to have the kind of system that the master plan promised. So I'm skeptical about where the reform will land, but I'm a big believer in you just keep nibbling away at this anyway. And I think the numbers I showed you today show it can be done without a legislative master plan.
So my background is community college, faculty of community college. And this whole topic of completion and persistence and student success, I loved what you said about it in the CSUs and the higher education. It's been used as a club on us. And so I think we have to be careful and look at where we put it and where it actually helps students of color and where it doesn't. But part of our difficulty is community college always had more than just getting a degree or a certificate. So we hope that retirees like me would be able to go back and take music and art and that kind of thing. And community college was part of that. We hope that people that were working in business downtown, I taught accounting, would come and take basic accounting with no intention of ever getting a degree. But they maybe got a raise from their boss because their boss wanted them to take accounting. And that, to me, is all of those things are success. And so the definition of success, if they try to club us with the completion thing, ends up hurting us. So maybe you can help us with that.
So I will make sure it's clear. My enthusiasm for this agenda is not uniformly shared by all of my colleagues. There are colleagues who are quite unhappy about the elimination of remediation. They don't believe in metrics. At one institution I worked at, in reference to a colleague whom I agreed with, they said every time Dave says the word data, an angel loses his wings. I don't agree with that, but I respect that there are lots of perspectives on this. I will also say that the UCs have the easiest mission of the three institutions. They're research focused, and they tend to bring in more elite students. I'm going to put elites in quotes, however you want to describe it. And those students tend to graduate at higher rates for socioeconomic reasons. You know, I used to joke around about, we have a son who went to Stanford. You could have left him on an island with a box of books, given him a test 4 years later, and he would have gotten a degree. He didn't need anybody. So they have an easier mission. The CSUs have a harder mission because we're trying to balance teaching and scholarship. The community colleges have the most complex mission because they do extended learning, lifelong learning, workforce development, certification, and access. So somehow we have to bifurcate those, segregate, I don't want to use that word, but identify the different segments, and it's only those that are headed towards that transfer that then you should be held. We have to be a little more sophisticated. But to go to your point about, but the community colleges also suffered from a lack of funding. The risk of sounding biased, the CSU has had the hardest time with funding of the 3 segments. But this is why, you know, city can't support art and can't, because they don't have the funding for it. So it goes back to that original master plan. I think you were.
I'll ask a question. So, what does get back to the dream of 60s higher education in California?
Yeah, I have an ask. About 250. Yep, there we go. $254 million. An additional $254 million, preferably by September 1st, would be really, really good. Yeah, it would take for the CSU right now about $254 million is a kind of rough. And I don't know what the number is for the UCs. They do receive more funding than we do, but yeah. For the UC budget, yeah.
You talked about in the accreditation process the shocking data that you discovered, and ultimately it being public and that changing rapidly as the organizations held accountable to that data. Now I'm curious, there's pretty limited data available across all 4-year, 2-year institutions. What's information that's not currently publicly available that you wish was across all institutions that they could be held accountable for?
I wish, you know, that's a good question. You know, maybe cost per student, but that might even be available. I will tell you, I am shocked at what's available out there. I'm a big believer. I carry in a thing called College Results Online. To me, I call it the kind of website of the truth, and it's got public and private, and it will tell you cost of attendance after grants, default rates on loans, retention rates, grad rates disaggregated by ethnicity. Maybe how, like I would love to have a conversation. My world is so CSU focused that I'd love to have a conversation with a colleague from a private university. I mean, I think about, I collect $7,500 in tuition and fees, and then I look at private colleagues here in the Bay Area, and they're collecting between $50,000 and $65,000, and I think, what could I do with another $55,000 per student? So I'd like to ask them, what do you do with all that money, and why don't you give some of it to us? So maybe something where expenditures a little bit, like how much are they spending on faculty versus something else. But I am, if you're interested in this, there are so many websites you can go. I could give up my day job and just spend time on those websites looking at this stuff. Don't worry, I'm not. My team will get really anxious.
Could you share some of the specific best practices that you said were identified in that small group in the early 2000s that are now more?
So eliminating remediation. Simplifying curriculum. There was a period, it was, who were we at war with in 2008, 2009? Without calling it a war. And we were removing our forces from there. There was a thing on the front page of the New York Times that showed the Pentagon's plan for removing the forces, and it was the most, like you got motion sick just looking at all the arrows. And I had a degree program I was trying to simplify that looked just like that. I didn't know how a student could ever figure out how to graduate with that degree program, because they would follow the line to here, and then it moved to a box that floated there. So cleaning up our curriculum, and then having professional advisors. Faculty are spectacular. They're spectacular. They're great teachers. They're great researchers. They're great mentors. But our degrees are complex, when you put in major and minor requirements and general education requirements. So professional advisors. Making it easier to apply for financial aid and get your financial aid. One institution I worked with that was on the quarter system didn't disperse. So, you have your cost, you get your financial aid. Low-income students basically get a check that they can then use to buy books and pay rent. At the institution that I was working with, they didn't disperse that till the third week of the quarter in a quarter system, which is only 10 weeks long. So that meant 1/3 of the student's term, they didn't have money for books, food, rent, those kinds of barriers. And then looking at why students, completion rates in courses. And we still have a lot of work to do on this, by the way. On inclusive pedagogies, we've just begun. But it's not acceptable to have a class where 1/3 of the students don't complete it. And this was kind of a revolution, and there will be people who say that did you say clobber? What do we do with them? Club. There are folks at Cal State Long Beach who will tell you I club them with those numbers, but I think it's unacceptable that you've taught a course and 40% or 30% don't complete the class and then have to repeat it. And again, there'll be some reasons to fail. I'm going to come clean. I never completed general chemistry despite 3 times. You're either looking at a failed pre-med major or a very successful history student. So sometimes you move on, but those kinds of things. Does that make it easy so that students can focus on what they need to focus on, which is their classwork?
Can you speak a little bit more about the student support services, especially about mental health and career guidance, especially for lower socioeconomic students who more often have these problems? I'm wondering how you're thinking about it and how you're making that transformative, especially today's colleges and study environments.
Thank you for mentioning that, because that's also, and that I would say is new. In 2005, 6, we didn't talk about counseling very much. We didn't talk about career services very much. And now I think there is an acute awareness that unwell students will not succeed. So I know all the universities have invested a lot in counseling, but also kind of more generally wellness programs, because you have the students who have the stress between where they need that. So, but again, this goes back to funding. So a lot of the ways universities do this, including my own, is we charge the student an extra fee. We can't fit it in the 7,500. Now, again, if I had 56,000, I could do that. But so, and then career services, I think really there are some institutions doing a spectacular job of it, but for most of us, we have catch up to do, because there are these studies that say, and sir, I don't know your name, but Berkeley and Jay? Jay's generation, according to national surveys, said they came to college to develop, number one reason to go to college was to develop a philosophy of life. Students last year, number one reason was to get a good job. And I have colleagues who say this as badly about the current generation. That was a generation of the mind. And well, if the cost of housing was what it was today, if it was what it's like today in 1968, you would have been really worried about a job. So I think we have to do a better job. And that isn't just to rush them into mind-numbing jobs, right? It's about helping them develop a meaningful focus, because that'll also help them graduate. So these are the kind of holistic services also I don't think we paid attention to in the past. Do you work in one of those?
I do. I have a company that's focused on getting students in rehearsed counseling
Good.
With specific high school students, allow them to learn careers directly from young professionals.
Oh, well, that's cool. I have no idea what time it is, too, so someone's going to tell me if I've been up here too long. Anyone have one last burning question?
I'm curious about the aspirational third leg of the